everyone. My name is Yasmin.
I'm Ahmed.
And we're joined today by Julia Mason Wedgle. Julia is a PhD student in religious studies at UNC Chapel Hill, where she studies activism as a form of lived religion, particularly among leftist American Jews, starting from the significant Jewish presence in the labor movement in the early 1900s through to contemporary Jewish anti-Zionism today. Thank you so much for joining us today, Julia.
Thank you for having me. I'm so excited to be here.
Yes. I'm going to give a little more context to our listeners before we get started. So Julia's is a PhD student in the same program that I graduated from. And so we've connected like virtually and on the phone in kind of a networking context. We actually haven't met in person. I'm sure we will at some point. But I follow Julia on Instagram, and I was really moved by her commentary and experiences studying Yiddish in Poland this summer, and the parallels that you were drawing between the Holocaust in Poland in the 1930s and the genocide in Gaza today. And so we're looking forward to kind of getting both your academic and personal perspective today. There are a few things that we'll touch on. I think it's kind of wide ranging. I was wondering maybe we can start off more with like your personal experiences growing up Jewish, your family's religious and migration history, what led you to study Yiddish in Poland. And from that, maybe we can move into a little bit about the history of Jews in Poland, and lastly, the parallels that you see with Palestine today, if that kind of sounds like a good trajectory for you, Julia. Yeah. Great. So let's start off with just kind of like your personal background, growing up Jewish, your family's background, if you're interested, if it feels relevant, some of the anti-Zionist work you've done, how you've gotten into that.
Well, yeah. So my family is from Eastern Europe. My family is all Ashkenazi Jews. All of my great-grandparents all of my grandparents were born in the United States. And for the most part, it was my great-grandparents who immigrated, except for one of my great-grandparents was born in New Hampshire, which is pretty long time to have been here for American Jews, that all of my grandparents were born here. So my family comes from Eastern Europe, mostly from Poland, Lithuania, Belarus, and Russia. Maybe Ukraine, we're not really sure. It's kind of hard to tell sometimes, because the records will often just say like Russia or Poland, or like Austro-Hungarian Empire. On this trip, we were able to go to two shtetls or towns that two of my great-grandfathers are from.
Oh, it's amazing.
Happy to talk more about that later, but that was pretty cool. But we only know like three specific places. The third one is in Belarus, so obviously we did not go there. So I grew up in a Reform synagogue. It was very Zionist. I think that really affected my Jewish education, which I really saw while I was in Poland and in Eastern Europe this summer, that I've seen it before too with what I don't know about progressive Jewish history in the United States, but also just what I didn't know about the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising, about the people in it, about these types of things. So yeah, happy to talk about that more later too. But I was really raised on these like strong Jewish values of repairing the world and of like pursuing justice and loving thy neighbor and these kinds of things. Which when I got to college, I realized just was not being applied to Palestine at all. So
can I ask real quick, just when you're growing up young, in kind of like a very heavily Zionist, synagogue, as you mentioned, when was the first time you remember hearing about Palestine, and kind of what was how was it presented?
Yeah. So my family was definitely less Zionist than the synagogue was, I would say. So you'll hear a lot of Jews talk about, like, I never heard the word Palestine, I never heard the word Palestinian until, maybe they went to college. But that was not true for me. Like, I did hear it. I would say my parents were very, like, two-state solution liberal Zionists. So I was hearing the word Palestinian. And first time I went to Israel, Palestine was right before my bat mitzvah. And it was right as the apartheid wall was starting to be built. And they were like, oh, this is a security fence. Like, blah, 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 whatever. And I was like, that's a wall. And my dad was like, that's a wall. So I think I definitely like kind of knew more than the average person, but it's more like, what was I taught in Sunday school, I was like, the quote unquote heroes we were taught about were Zionist leaders, not these, progressive leaders like from the ghetto uprising and from the labor movement. And then I was really active in a Jewish youth group in high school and really kind of became more conservative than my parents at that time. Because it was really pushed on me that wherever we stand with Israel. And so then it was a lot of unlearning once I got to college.
Yeah, I didn't, I grew up Muslim, but not very practicing. I didn't really learn about Palestine until college. I'm ashamed to say it just wasn't a part of my education in any context. And it wasn't until I like kind of became part of faith communities in college that I was exposed to different perspectives, or even really thought about the issue.
Yeah.
Oh, sorry, you go first.
Oh, I was going to say that then like the real moment where I started to really be like, this is not okay, is I like to call myself a birthright failure. So I went on Birthright, and that was really when I started to see like, this is unacceptable.
Wow.
And I came back and I joined Jewish Voice for Peace.
That's kind of an awesome response, because I feel like it's, from what I've heard, that Torah is like so tailored to not give you any other perspective. That's cool that you were able to see through that.
Yeah.
Sorry, do you remember any specific things that happened on Birthright that you saw that you were like, that made you, think that this is an occupation?
So I think I was starting to think it before, because I studied peace and justice studies in undergrad. And, I'd taken like the intro class. I went the summer between my freshman and sophomore year. And then I also stayed afterwards in Haifa doing this like program. So some of the things that happened were more on that. But one thing that happened was so they say they don't go to the West Bank, but they do. That's not true. And we crossed through a checkpoint, and, we just went right through. And I was like, oh, what? Like, why were we able to do that? Like this, like I knew it was a checkpoint. And they were like, oh, it was a toll booth and we have an easy pass.
Oh, God.
Which like they did have essentially an easy pass, which is Israeli plates. And the Birthright, they put these like banners on the bus. So that was like one moment. And then another moment was actually at Yad Vashem, which is the Holocaust Museum in Jerusalem. And I think it's in Jerusalem. It might be in Tel Aviv. Pretty sure it's in Jerusalem. There, the woman was like talking about, she was like showing us, Nazi propaganda and whatever. And she was like, well, today, like the like equivalent is anti-Zionism. And I was like, that's just not true. Like, that's just wrong. And then I stayed on this program afterwards, and I just started reading these books. I think I read some fiction books. I read Jimmy Carter's book, which certainly isn't like the most radical of books, but it taught me a lot. And then I came home. I did join J Street for like 5 minutes. I was like, nope, this is not it. And then I reached out to the Boston organizer of JVP, and I'm about to reach my JVP bat mitzvah, as I call it.
That's so cute.
I'm about to reach 13 years in JVP in November.
Yeah. I just looked it up. The Holocaust Museum is in Jerusalem, which I feel like is a very intentional political choice to put it there and not in Tel Aviv.
Yeah. Well, and they have like at the end of it, which I remember from both, I've been 3 times, but the 3rd time I went to Israel Palestine was like after I was an anti-Zionist, and I mostly went to the West Bank. But
can I ask, when you go to the West Bank on Birthright, how is the West Bank talked about? Is it talked about as the West Bank, or is it referred to by like as Judea and Samaria?
So it wasn't really referred to by anything. Like they kept telling us we were still in Jerusalem. I think we maybe were mostly in East Jerusalem, but across checkpoints. So I guess like the Jerusalem suburbs, which they may have said that we were in the suburbs. It was a long time ago.
Got it.
But
yeah.
And then the other time we went to the West Bank, which is when we crossed through the checkpoint, was when we went to the Dead Sea. And there are Dead Sea beaches that are not in the West Bank, but I think the majority of them are in the West Bank. So they just like were like, oh, we're going to the Dead Sea, like like, make sure you don't shave tomorrow so it doesn't hurt. Like, or like tonight, like it was not mentioned.
Yeah.
I want to kind of, oh, sorry, you go first.
Oh, sorry. I was just going to say with Yad Vashem that I did think it was in Jerusalem because the way they end it, you know, it's like very sad. I think in many ways it is a very well done museum. Although of course it is very Zionist, but they end it with this like beautiful vista of Jerusalem that's supposed to be this like, look, we survived. Now we have this state, whatever. And I think it's like really horrible because of course in Jerusalem, Palestinians are occupied as well. And, you know, then the West Bank is so close.
Yeah. I will say when you Google Julia, one of the first things that comes up is your Canary Mission profile. So props to you. I always kind of feel like the fact that I'm not on Canary Mission yet, I'm sort of grateful for, but probably means I haven't done enough. It sort of has become a weird badge of honor.
Yes, I do know that it is the first.
Yeah. So I'm interested in this, like these kind of Jewish leftist movements that now obviously, you know, is the focus of your academic career, but you kind of became personally motivated and excited by. I know you focus on the U.S., but if you could tell us, I'm ashamed to say it's only very recently through my students actually that are trying to build, and I'm not like an advisor to this or anything. They just kind of talked about it to me in a personal office hours capacity because I'm always interested in religious life, you know, even including on campus. But some of the students on our campus are trying to kind of build some institutional alternatives to Hillel. And so they are calling themselves the Jewish Bund movement, and was really well educated by my students and kind of ashamed that I didn't know much about the movement. So if you could tell us a little bit about like the Bundist movements, leftist movements kind of starting in Central and Eastern Europe, that I assume the kind of trajectory of those you follow, you know, in your own academic work in the US.
Yeah. So the Jewish General Labor Bund was one of the largest Jewish political parties in Eastern Europe, primarily in Poland, Lithuania, and Russia, but of course, you know, borders were quite different. What do those locations mean? But yeah, so it was/is, because there has been continual Bundist presence, although smaller for much time. So the Bund is socialist, anti-Zionist, and secular, and Yiddishist. So socialist is pretty obvious what that means, but that is very important to the Bund, is that they are socialist. There was other parties having kind of these other same values that were not socialist. So that is very important that they were socialist. And very specifically socialist and not communist. They actually had like armed fights in the street with Jewish communists.
Oh my.
In the interwar period. Anyways, and then the anti-Zionism, I don't know that they necessarily at that time would refer to themselves as anti-Zionist, although I did see a quote at the Jewish Museum in Poland from the Bund that said, hold on, I did write it down. It said, Bund builds, Zionism ruins. So I thought that was really interesting. But basically the Bund believed in this concept of Doikheit, which means here-ness. And they also had this saying that basically translate to there where we live, that is our homeland. So the idea is basically that is like seeking justice and seeking civil rights where you are. And it's opposed to the there-ness of Zionism.
Right.
So that is like a very important point and remains a very important point of people who are Bundists today, whether or not they're in like a formal Bundist, you know, group, or if they are just like consider themselves a Bundist.
This might be such a like ignorant question, but like one of my only contexts for thinking about like prominent Jewish labor history in the U.S. is like Emma Goldman, who I know is an anarchist. She wouldn't be a Bundist, would she? Or
no, she
okay.
wouldn't be a Bundist. But a lot of the, I can get to it in a minute, but a lot of the other people, especially a lot of the women, would be more Bundist.
Gotcha. And just a quick clarification for our listeners, can you tell us a little bit about what you mean by kind of like Yiddish centric, or like what are like what is the kind of significance of that?
That was what I was getting to. So before that, they were secular, so that's also very important to them. They were not religious. They might have been keeping kosher. They might have been praying because religion looked quite different, but being secular was very important to them. And then the Yiddishist part is that they believed in Yiddish culture and Yiddish language and building like Yiddish society. So part of that is that like Yiddish is a language, it's not a jargon, which is what Zionists would say. There's like this long history of this within Zionism, of this like quote unquote battle between Yiddish and Hebrew, because all of them were Yiddish speakers, but they wanted to create this new language, to create this new identity, they being the Zionists, to create this new language, like modern Hebrew, to create this new identity of like the Israeli as opposed to the diaspora Jew. So the Bund, on the other hand, was very diaspora centric, and so that's where the Yiddishists come in. I think sometimes today people kind of look at that as this like exclusion of, you know, Ladino, Judeo-Spanish speaking Jews, or Arabic speaking Jews, you know, Jews speaking not Yiddish because of where they were located. But I think that at the time it was like they didn't really know those people existed. I mean, they, you know, maybe they did, but like it was about like speaking Yiddish, like being a people where they were located, and then fighting for their rights there, because they often didn't have citizenship. They didn't have citizenship in the Russian Empire. So it's like fighting for their own civil rights and the civil rights for other minorities there. But part of that was like, you know, kind of having this not national identity, but like group identity. So Yiddish was very important to that. And then today, Yiddishists are the people who are trying to really rebuild secular Yiddish culture and secular Yiddish language and these types of things.
I've heard some really lovely Yiddish protest songs that are like, I think have been sung for a long time in the US that are really fun to listen to.
In Eastern Europe as well. Like there's a song called Doloi Police, which
that's the one I've heard.
Yeah. Basically means fuck the police. And yeah, it's one of my favorite songs. There's also another song called Oyanarsh Zionitsin, which means "Oh, you foolish little Zionist," which is another favorite. I recommend it. And another one is called Olive Breeder, which means like we are all brothers. Later they talk about all being sisters, which is just like a very socialist song about fighting together.
Is Yiddish like somewhat mutually intelligible with German, or is it kind of like you might understand a couple of words like Spanish and Italian, but you wouldn't like be able to get everything if you spoke German?
So you wouldn't be able to get everything.
Yeah.
Ladino, which is Judeo-Spanish, is more aligned with Spanish, although it's a very old version of Spanish, basically because it developed in isolation after 1492. Mm-hmm. But Yiddish, about 2/3 of the vocabulary comes from German. And then the rest comes from Slavic languages and from, it's called Loishan Kodesh, which means holy languages. So Biblical Hebrew and Aramaic. And there's a little bit of Romance influence too. There's this very famous sentence that I can send you, but it shows you like the 4 languages.
Influences all in one. Cool.
Yeah. And most of the grammar also comes from German, but some of it does come from Slavic languages as well. But it comes from Middle High German, which I don't really totally know what that means, but I think it's different than the German that's spoken today.
Gotcha.
In Germany, I think it's similar to like Swiss German. I think I'm not really sure. But they are like pretty mutually intelligible. And during World War II, actually, in the U.S. Army, a lot of German English translators were actually Yiddish speakers.
Oh, interesting.
My understanding is that Yiddish speakers, like if you're fluent, which I'm certainly not, understand more German than German speakers understand Yiddish because of these other words and things in it. But yeah, they are somewhat mutually intelligible, but also the pronunciation is quite different. Like I was in Berlin at the beginning of my trip, and when I hear German, to me, it sounds like mispronounced Yiddish, although in reality, probably Yiddish is more mispronounced. Or not mispronounced.
Who's to say? Right, depends on your perspective.
But yeah, I would say like a lot of the things are pronounced pretty differently.
So moving kind of from this leftist movement, can you talk a little bit about the Nazi occupation of Poland, sort of that really terrible transition period, what it looked like for Jewish communities in Poland, and then tell our listeners a little bit about the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising?
Sure, yeah. Did you want me to talk about the leftists coming?
Yeah, absolutely.
America?
Totally.
So yeah, a lot of the Jewish immigrants who came to the U.S., of course, were these leftists, these Bundists. So when they got to the U.S., they founded mutual aid societies like Arbiter Ring, which is Worker Circle, which still exists today in like New York and Boston and Chicago and I think LA. And that was really based on the concepts of Bundism, but just like wasn't called the Bund. And then many of these people, especially the women, were working in garment factories in New York. And so they got very involved in the labor movement and really were leaders of the labor movement. So my favorite person from the labor movement, her name is Clara Lemlich. And she, there was this meeting of like hundreds, if not thousands of people at Cooper Union Hall. And it went on for like 2 hours. And the men are just like talking and talking and talking. And she had just come from the hospital because she'd been beat up on a picket line by a cop. And she comes into the meeting and she interrupts it. And she's basically like, I'm one of the working girls you're talking about. And I move, we go on general strike. And over the next few days, 20,000 people, predominantly Jewish and Italian recent immigrants, walked off the job.
Wow.
And it's called the Uprising of the 20,000. The strike lasted, I think, from November to February, and did win. They won a contract at a lot of the garment factories, specifically the shirtwaist factories, because that's specifically what the strike was at, which is like women's clothes, women's blouses. And so they won pretty sweeping, like pretty good contract. There was still a lot of problems, but the only factory, not the only factory, but the biggest holdout from signing the contract was the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory. And then approximately 1 year later was the fire, which then also brought more sweeping changes. And a lot of these same leaders, mostly women, really pushed for those changes because, you know, they lost friends in the fire or relatives and were just like devastated because they knew what was wrong at the factory prior. And like, it was not surprising what happened. Because the conditions were so bad. And then a lot of these people stayed in the labor movement for the rest of their lives, fighting both for themselves and also for others with bad working conditions.
And this is kind of the focus of your research, right? Of your dissertation?
Yeah, starting
That's
there
incredible.
and kind of looking at where did they place religion because they were also quite secular. And then looking maybe at some other movements, I'm not really sure. Not really there
When
yet.
you say secular in this context, I'm just curious, do you mean kind of like, what do you mean by that?
Yeah, so that's like also a question that I have is what did they mean by secular? Because like I said, the Bund was like secular, but what did that mean? And then what did it mean here? But essentially it was that like they were not following strictly the rules. And like I learned this summer that, for example, like the Bund in Warsaw, they had this restaurant that was next to this like Orthodox synagogue, and they would be open on Saturdays and serve pork. So really kind of just like trying to move away from this very strict religiosity.
So like still identifying very much as Jewish, but like not as much following like halakha or like Jewish law to the T.
Yeah,
okay.
Exactly. And it's kind of what we might consider like culturally Jewish today, like quote unquote.
But you're saying it could include folks who maybe today would be identified in the U.S. as like Reform, like still practicing or praying, but not like basically, is it kind of like a separation of church and state sort of thing, to use a U.S. parlance? Like
maybe not totally.
Not quite, okay.
It was really like about that Judaism is like more than a religion.
Okay.
And is like this culture, and that's where the Yiddish culture comes in and these types of things.
Gotcha.
But that is a great question, and I certainly have more to learn about that. But it was really with this self-identification of we are secular.
Great. So I think if we could move back to kind of this scene in Europe and what that looked like, I'm assuming that the Bundist movement, did it sort of collapse under Nazi occupation? I'm guessing a lot of people obviously migrated during that time.
Yeah, and also were killed.
Right.
Yeah, so the Bundist movement was very strong in the interwar period, particularly in Poland. And then, obviously the Nazi occupation and the Holocaust, and so many people were murdered, and really this system of Jewish political parties fell apart, is my understanding. So the Bund was part of that, but like I said, there was continuation of the Bund, particularly in Australia, and then also continuation of these kind of successor organizations like Worker Circle in the United States. But many of the leaders of the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising and also the Oneg Shabbos collective, which was this group that collected these archives in the Warsaw Ghetto and then hid them in milk cans, and it's a lot of why we know what happened.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, it's really, really interesting, and I think, yeah, I can talk about it more later, but there's a lot of comparisons, I think, there also to Gaza with how people are documenting what's happening. Yeah, so many of the leaders of the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising were Bundists, but there also were, Zionist leaders or other types of leaders of the Ghetto Uprising and also of the Oneg Shabbos collective. And so something interesting to me is, they really came together to fight against the Nazis and against fascism. Mm-hmm. So that is interesting to me. But yeah, I think really after the war, there was just like so little Jewish community left and so many people were leaving. But of course, people did stay, and there were people who were still socialists and involved in these types of kind of leftist movements. But of course, after the war, then in Poland, there was Soviet occupation. And so what did being this type of socialist look like, especially with Soviet anti-Semitism happening? So yeah, I think I'm not really as familiar with what happened in Europe with the Bund after the war.
Yeah, that makes sense.
But many leaders and many people were dead.
And what was it like for you, like studying Yiddish in Poland this summer and like experiencing this, or like not experiencing, but kind of like learning firsthand about this history, seeing these sites?
Yeah, totally. So, yeah, I think for me, learning Yiddish in Poland, learning Yiddish has always felt really powerful because it feels like really this reclamation of Jewish diaspora identity, both like a reclamation from earlier anti-Semitism, from the pogroms, which is when my family left, from the Holocaust, and also from the Zionist movement, because the Zionist movement also really wanted to get rid of Yiddish and get rid of diaspora Judaism. Early Zionists said a lot of, I think, really anti-Semitic things about diaspora Jews. So I think it's kind of this moment of survival. And then I think to like learning Yiddish is this type of survival and this type of resistance. And then to learn Yiddish in Poland feels like even more of that, like that, kind of bringing Yiddish back, I guess, making sure there is a Yiddish presence. Yeah, so it just felt like this very powerful type of survival, I guess. And then learning about these people, like I couldn't, 8 weeks ago, I couldn't have told you the names that I just said, like Mordechai Anielewicz and Mark Edelman, who are both leaders of the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising. I didn't know what the Oneg Shabbos Collective was, all of these things, which, like I said, I think Zionism played a big role in why I don't know those things, because why I wasn't taught about that in like Sunday school. So yeah, I would say it was just like a really powerful experience. And, of course, it was also difficult. I'm not the best at languages.
Same, girl, same. I've taken Arabic for like years on and off just to be highly mediocre.
Yeah, languages are very hard. But yeah, I would say it's just like really powerful. And I was living in what was once the ghetto, which also certainly was quite a powerful experience. Very sad, of course, but also, yeah, I guess powerful is the right way.
How are people there with like remembering this history? Like, is it something that is openly talked about and marked through landmarks? Is it kind of like a hidden history?
Yeah, so I think it's really openly talked about. I think that what is not talked about is, of course, there were Polish people resisting. Of course, the Nazis were also targeting Poles. My understanding is that within Poland, 3 million Jews were murdered and 2 million Poles. Because Slavic people were also kind of on the Nazis. I mean, they were on the Nazis list of like, people they hated, but they were like a little bit higher. And a little bit, the Nazis liked them a little bit better than they liked Jews, but they still hated them. I guess I don't really know how to explain it, but if that makes sense. And so, but of course, there were also Polish people who were involved. So I think that is like not talked about. Like it's like this was all the Germans. But other than that, I would say it is pretty openly talked about. They have markers in all the cities I went to of what was the outline, or sorry, where the ghetto was. Usually they're kind of on the ground, and then they'll have like in Warsaw, they have like a plaque with it. There's lots of memorials all over the place. I would say,
sorry, can we take a step back and maybe describe the conditions of the Warsaw Ghetto and what preceded the uprisings? Because, my understanding is that at some point, through the occupation of Poland, the Nazis increasingly packed Jews into more and more dense ghettos. And it was kind of out of this like very dense, densely populated environment that, they decided to take up armed resistance. And as you hinted at earlier, it was not just Jewish leftists, but also the Jewish right that's kind of collaborating on armed resistance against Nazis.
Yeah. And also leftist Zionists, like I do think that's important to say, like socialist Zionists were also a big part of it, even though Zionism is not a leftist movement. Like there were labor Zionists. So
are you saying that they perceived themselves to be both leftist and Zionist, or is that kind of...
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
Interesting.
And there are still people who would consider themselves labor Zionists today, but that is not the point. So I'm definitely not an expert on the ghetto, but my understanding is really similar to what you just said. So in Warsaw, the ghetto was a predominantly Jewish neighborhood. So at a certain point, the Nazis said only Jews can be here and all Jews must be here. So if you were a non-Jew living within the ghetto, you were forced out. And if you were a Jew living outside the ghetto, you were forced in. So the conditions were very, very crowded, like you said. And then they put up these walls. People were not allowed to leave. And then, like you said, they pushed them into smaller and smaller areas. So in Warsaw, initially there was like the big ghetto and the small ghetto, and they were connected by a bridge, I think. I don't know. I've never seen The Pianist, but the bridge is like a big deal in that movie. I'm not really sure. And so anyways, yeah. And then, many things that are quite similar to what is happening in Gaza, especially around not allowing in food and really trying to starve people and creating, very unsanitary conditions, overcrowding, these types of things. And then eventually deportation started from within the ghetto.
Right. And I think, and sorry, because I'm sure you're going to get to it, but I think deportation as it is now was a euphemism at the time. And that's kind of upon discovery, it was, that deportation really meant essentially marches to death camps and not, just labor camps was a spur.
Yeah. So, and certainly, especially in Warsaw, most people were quote unquote deported, but, were forced to Treblinka, which was a death camp. I think it's like 45-minute drive from Warsaw today. But they did go on trains mostly in Warsaw. But yes, also it was marches to these types of camps. And yeah, so most people who lived in the ghetto ultimately were murdered. either in the death camps or through starvation and disease within the ghetto. People were often shot within the ghetto by the Nazis. So yeah, in many ghettos, they started forming kind of these underground combat movements. But in Warsaw, while the ghetto uprising was not successful, ultimately it did happen. Like, they did have this uprising that we know about, of course, today. And then 1 year later, there was the Warsaw Uprising, which is different, which I did not know before I went there. But that was an uprising of Poles against the Nazis. But the Polish army, I don't know that that's what it was called, but the people who were planning the Warsaw Uprising were helping to get weapons to the people who did the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising. I think it was the Jewish Combat Organization. And that was the organization that kind of had, you know, these people of different political parties and these types of things in it. And so Mordechai Anielewicz was the like commander of that. And then ultimately, a lot of the leaders ended up committing suicide in a bunker because they wanted to die. They didn't want the Nazis to kill them. That was very important to them, even though, of course, they died because of the Nazis. And so then some people escaped, like Merrick Edelman, who I spoke about, and he ultimately survived the war, but very few people survived. But it was successful in that it happened. Whereas in other ghettos, it was, I don't totally know how, but, you know, it was really like squashed before there was any type of uprising. But I think
under those conditions, I feel like it's so difficult to organize. It's so impressive that they were able to.
Yeah. But I do feel like it's important to recognize that there was resistance in other ghettos.
Mm-hmm.
It's just like we don't know about it because
it didn't reach that level of like armed resistance in a way that was so visible. Yeah.
Yeah. So, I mean, I think we're definitely going to get into the parallels in Gaza and, you know, the Israeli occupation of Palestine. Because, I mean, I'm sure other people have talked about it. The parallels are quite obvious. But I'm curious. So a lot of people will take the events of October 7th and say, like, you know, any call for intifada or whatever, any mention of intifada necessarily means that you are asking for the extermination of all Jews. Although, I mean, maybe, I'm sure you know this too, but when the International Holocaust Museum translated documents about the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising, so translating primary documents into several languages, Arabic being one of them, it referred to the uprisings as intifada, right? So very much meaning So when those documents were translated, they did refer to it as intifada in Arabic, which, I mean, only means that you can't just take a term and then say like this, just redefine it categorically, right? But I'm also curious, when we think of like propaganda, did you come across any, I'm always curious about like after the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising, for the 3 years remaining in World War II after that, what do you know of any like Nazi propaganda that kind of just like mirrors the same Israeli talking points that's just like, the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising is asking for German genocide or something like this?
Yeah, I don't know of any, but I think that may have been because after the uprising, they really destroyed the ghetto and just sent everyone to either Auschwitz or to Treblinka, depending on their if they could work, I guess, or not. And so, yeah, I don't know of any, but there may have been some. But my understanding is there was some of that type of propaganda in South Africa during apartheid, which is obviously a different context. But yeah, I don't think there was in Warsaw.
Got it.
And then I think we're sort of already getting here naturally. So we'd just love to hear about your experiences this summer and the kind of, I mean, this is what initially moved me about hearing about your reflections, kind of the parallels that you've drawn to thinking about Gaza today.
Yeah, definitely. So I think, I mean, I've always seen the parallels. I also in undergrad study abroad in Rwanda and also have, really always seen the parallels to the 1994 genocide um, of the Tutsi in Rwanda, between the Holocaust and that. And also, I would say a little bit less so between Gaza and that, just because of how they manifested. But yeah, so I think, I saw them. I think before I went this summer, I did struggle to kind of make this Holocaust comparison, even though, what is happening in Gaza is a genocide. I think that I think before October 7th, I thought the Holocaust comparison was just kind of a bad strategy because like people find it very knee-jerk offensive. Yeah. But now I think that it's just so stark, like we can see it so much with the ghetto, for example. We saw them pushing them into smaller and smaller and smaller areas, of course bombing the ghetto as well, and then giving people less and less food, creating these conditions where there's widespread disease and infections and these types of things, where kind of really squashing any sort of organizing, like you said, but even more like above ground organizing of like civil services within the ghetto. So I think that was when I really started to see it. Was I went my first weekend, I went on like a free walking tour of the ghetto, and really started to see it then. On that tour, he really talked about one of the other people I mentioned, Merrick Edelman, who he did not mention that his whole life was an anti-Zionist, but he was the one who survived. He stayed in Poland, and he has these quotes really talking about his fear about what Israel might become, and that it could become similar to what happened to him and his comrades in the ghetto. And then a few days after I took that tour, there was an article published in Haaretz. I think the headline is Israel is building a ghetto in Gaza. And I think that was really stark. It was about Mordechai Anielewicz and how he would be so ashamed of what is happening, and that it goes against everything that he fought for in his Jewish defense during the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising. So I think that was when I started to see it. And then I think being in Eastern Europe at this time was just like so devastating because there are so many similarities. I think, of course I would have seen them at any time, but seeing photos of starving children, it looked like, well, they're in black and white usually from the Holocaust, but other than that, they look exactly like photos that I'm seeing out of Gaza, which, we've seen on social media, people putting these photos side by side. But like when I was at Auschwitz, there was this photo that I saw of, it was actually of Roma children, who, were just skin and bones, and it looked just like photos that I've seen in the newspaper or whatever today from Gaza. So yeah, I would say those are some of the similarities I saw. And then I think the dehumanization of Jews during the Holocaust and of Palestinians today. And then I think really like seeing with the Oneg Shabbos collective that I was talking about, the similarities, we went to where the documents are held, and the similarities were just like so stark. They have this quote, I think it's like, here, I can look for it for a second because.
You mean the similarities in terms of like people documenting their own genocide and trying to like preserve their story? Yeah,
exactly. So the exhibit of the document opens with this quote: "What we've been unable to shout to the world," and like saying that is what these documents are. And only 3 people from the collective survived, and they are how, I don't know, whoever archaeologists, I guess, whoever dug up the milk cans that the documents were hidden in, that's how they knew where they were.
Mm.
One of the milk cans has never been found. Maybe it will be one day. But the other ones were found. But I think the difference is today we are seeing it live streamed on our phones. And so Gazans are shouting to the world, but people are not listening. And then there was this quote that I saw that was from one of the documents that really echoed the poem If I Shall Die. It had even those same words in it.
Wow.
Yeah, it said I must die, but I've done what I had to do, and I'd like the memory, this person was an artist, of my paintings to survive. So really continuing the memory, and the people in the Oneg Shabbos collective are, you know, really able to speak to us from like beyond the grave. And I think, you know, we're seeing that so often in Gaza when journalists are killed and when people who are documenting their lives within Gaza are also killed. And then I think seeing the memorials also often made me think, like, what will the memorials look like? And that's like such a horrible thing to be thinking of. I think that like I said, I studied abroad in Rwanda, and I thought I would think about Rwanda much more on this trip than I did, but I found myself not really thinking about it. I think because I saw so many similarities to what is happening right now. And of course, there are so many similarities to Rwanda, but that is not something we can stop now. But Gaza is, and like we can resist now. So yeah, I would say those are like the main things I saw. But I think what was powerful was to see the similarities and the resistance. And I think for me, really in the documenting and trying to tell people what's happening. But of course, there wasn't TikTok and Instagram during the Holocaust.
Right.
And so that's why we know so much after, but we know what's happening now.
I saw that you went to a pro-Palestine protest. I think, was it in Warsaw? What was that like?
Yeah, that was like such a powerful experience. I don't think I ever thought that I would be at a Palestine solidarity protest in Poland. So the protest started at the U.S. Embassy and went to the Prime Minister's office, like the Polish Prime Minister's office. They're like on the same street. With a lot of other embassies too. And yeah, it was interesting. Way more of the protest was in English than I expected, including like some of the speeches. A lot of them were in Polish also. And Free Palestine was chanted in 3 languages, in Polish, English, and Arabic. I think something that stood out to me is that there's a 4th language that it should have, like, that should be in Poland today, which is Yiddish. But, you know, Yiddish and its speakers, of course, I mean, its speakers were murdered in the Holocaust. And so I think for me, not having that was also this, like, very stark reality. But yeah, during the protest, I asked my friend, I was like, what do you think my ancestors would think of me being at this protest? And he was basically like, they would say, what the heck is Israel? Like, because that was not something they would have imagined, or they probably would have wanted to imagine, because they wanted rights in Poland.
Yeah.
And of course, like I said, my family left before the Holocaust. But yeah, so I don't know. I'm still struggling to put my finger on exactly what was so powerful about the experience, but it really was so powerful. I don't think that this protest of like not even 100 people in Poland on a random Sunday like really did much to stop the genocide. But I think that keeping Palestine present in people's minds, you know, even if a few people on the street saw it, is really important. And yeah, I think just being in this protest in this place where my family was, they weren't in Warsaw, but in Poland, where my family was, and where my family was like forced out of, because nobody should be forced out of their homes. So yeah, I would say it was a very powerful experience. And I was really nervous to go because I'd never been to a protest outside of the US. But I'm really glad that I did go.
I'm curious to kind of just bring the conversation back to what mainstream or even like liberal Zionist posture toward anti-Zionist Jews is currently, and maybe how that has evolved over the last 2 years. What's your take on that?
Yeah. I mean, I think it remains pretty similar to what it's always been. I think maybe they're kind of panicking because there has been such a growth of the number of anti-Zionist Jews. Of course, there were many before, but we've seen, like, just in the Triangle, like the chapter of JVP, which has always been a very large chapter, actually.
Yeah,
such a badass chapter. They defunded like the Durham police from investment from Israel like years ago. They're so cool.
Yeah. Like, I would say has at least doubled in size, if not tripled. But yeah, I think in the last few weeks, as we've really kind of seen some shift in the narrative around the starvation, maybe some of their attitudes have changed, but I certainly don't think the Zionist attitudes, but I think maybe some of the liberal Zionist attitudes are starting to change, but I don't really know how much has changed, and I don't really know how much will change until they start to realize that, like, they are losing all of these people, like, because Jewish continuity and Jewish survival is so important, which, like, of course you can have, and we are having as we build Judaism without Zionism and, like, beyond Zionism, or rebuild Judaism without Zionism, because there's always been anti-Zionist Jews, but, like, build it with more power today. But yeah, I think maybe as they start to see all these young people leaving, things will start, and older people, but they need the young people for the future.
Because I ask because I mean I think this is not something that's unique to Judaism. I mean, obviously, a lot of more conservative, like, fundamentalist people in Islam will do a thing called takfir, which is like, they see someone practicing in a way that they don't like, or some aspect of their relationship with Islam that's that they don't particularly like, and takfiris will just say, like, oh, this person's not actually Muslim,
right? As if they are God.
And so I wonder if specifically in the religious context or in the communities, if that tension is felt, where, I mean, I think you kind of said it's like there's a community of anti-Zionist Jews who are trying to build Judaism beyond and without Zionism.
Especially, like, institutionally, I guess that's the big thing. Yeah.
But I guess, like, what does that look like at the places of worship?
Yeah. I think that it really kind of depends on the, like, mainstream place of worship, because we do have, anti-Zionist places of worship now in the Triangle. We have one of, I think, 3 explicitly anti-Zionist shuls in the country. It's called Macomb. It officially started after you guys. It officially started my first year. Like, that was its first high holidays.
Nice.
So it would have been left. But yeah. So
let me ask. You said there are 3 explicitly anti-Zionist shuls in the country, that being one of them. Did they all pop up around the same time, or have others been around for a bit longer?
Others have been around for a bit longer, and Macomb was, like, which is the one in the Triangle, was, like, in the works. I'm not, like, 100% familiar with the history because I wasn't here.
Yeah.
But, like, I knew before I moved, and I moved before October 7th. Like, I moved in August 2023. I knew that it was, like, I think it officially started in May 2023, but its first high holidays were September, October 2023. But the high holidays were over. Like, the last high holiday was on October 7th.
Yeah.
So, it had already had its first high holidays with, like, probably, like, 50, 60 people at each service. But there has been a lot of there's something called a Havurah, which is kind of the best equivalent. It's like a house church. It's kind of like a lay-led Jewish group, although sometimes you might have a rabbi. But yeah, a house church is really the best equivalent. So there have been a lot of Havurahs that have popped up that are anti-Zionist. And there's also a lot of, like, synagogues that maybe identify more as non-Zionist, in many, many places. It's just like identifying as explicitly anti-Zionist is these three.
Gotcha.
And certainly, like I said, Macomb was in the works. And so it's not something that happened after October 7th, but some of these newer iterations of things. And then, rabbis for ceasefire started after October 7th, and they published this, like, I can't remember exactly what they call it, but it's basically like a list of like friendly synagogues that they'll publish for the high holidays. That's pretty cool. It's not necessarily like, it's not all anti-Zionist, but it'll have questions like, which clergy are members of Rabbis for Ceasefire, and which, like, is there an Israeli flag on the pulpit, and these types of things. And it's pretty cool map. So there certainly are spaces. But I think that still from the institutional community, we see this narrative of like, oh, these anti-Zionists, like, they're not real Jews. Like, it's such a minority, like, blah, blah, blah. And so I think, definitely the, like, these aren't real Jews thing happens. But I think it's happening less from like a religious perspective necessarily, but it's this like perspective that they think that to be Jewish, you have to be Zionist, but that's not true. That's never been true.
Right. I mean, I find it offensive whenever anyone tries to kind of like intra-community police, like including Muslims. But I feel like given the just like really, really devastating history of Jews in Europe, it feels especially offensive to do that, I feel, I mean, it's not my history, maybe it's not my place to say, but to be like, well, you're not really Jewish. It's like that. I mean, just given like how much Jews have been forced to identify as Jewish, whether they want to or not, that just seems like a crazy thing to do from a historical standpoint.
Oh, totally, totally. And I think, we've seen that for a long time, calling people self-hating Jews, calling them anti-Semites, all of these things happen to me many times. But I think though, to me, it's worse when someone calls someone a self-hating Jew, or I think the worst is when you'll hear Zionists call anti-Zionist capos. But I think also saying that they're not real Jews is pretty offensive.
Yeah. Capos being the term used against Jews who would rat out other Jews to Zionists, right?
No, to the...
Yeah. Or sorry, to Nazis.
Yeah.
Sorry. Yeah. Oh, Freudian slip there a little bit.
Yeah, so the capos were, it's not just they would rat them out, like they were
collaborators.
Yeah, collaborators with the Nazis.
But I do think sometimes they were forced, but that is different. I think that capo is now used as such an insult, whether or not in reality the capo, like many, were forced to collaborate.
I'm going to say briefly, not to make this about us, but I feel like just when you were saying about kind of like the equivalent of house churches, it's always on my to-do list, and maybe one day, inshallah, I'll actually get to it, to like try and force myself to be part of institutional communities. I think religious community, I think so much good can kind of come from that. But we've also found I feel like a lot of nonprofit spaces and like other spaces have been where we've actually found spiritual community. So I also really relate to that. I think the sticking issue for me is often like how the Muslim communities institutionally are handling issues of queerness. So I resonate with that struggle to find a spiritual home that has institutional backing as opposed to something more informal.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
Well, I feel like we're naturally getting here, and maybe I can close us off on something that bridges two aspects of the conversation we've been having, which is one, Polish culture, and the other one being Zionism. So I don't know if you've heard of the ongoing controversy in Martha's Vineyard in the last couple of days with Alan Dershowitz.
No.
But he has been carrying out a vendetta against a pierogi salesperson. So at Martha's Vineyards, there's like a farmer's market where this vendor who goes by Good Pierogi refused to sell pierogis to Alan Dershowitz. And he maintains that it is a virulent act of anti-Semitism. I'm just going to read a little bit from the Cape Cod.
This is so random.
Cape Cod Times, and this is like
my favorite. I'm on Cape Cod right now, so that's funny.
Are you really?
Yeah. But Martha's Vineyard is off of it's an island off of Cape Cod, but I love the Cape Cod Times. It's one of the funniest papers I've ever read for the most part. But this sounds like it'll be.
Are you aware of this ongoing pierogi mayhem? Okay, so just kind of reading here, a spat over a pierogi vendor refusing to sell a multimillionaire continues to draw attention. That's a weird first sentence. Good Pierogi, the Martha's Vineyard pierogi vineyard, that refused to sell to famous lawyer and multimillionaire Alan Dershowitz, has spoken out on Instagram after continued public aspersions cast by Dershowitz. The vendor cited the attorney's legal representation of sexual predators, specifically naming the late sex offender Jeffrey Epstein, as the reason for the July 30th, 2025 refusal. Quoted, I personally know too many sexual abuse survivors. Mr. Dershowitz consciously decided to befriend and defend men who have been accused of abusing and harming women. And so this is the stated reason for not selling him. I don't know if, I'm sure maybe now you can, there's like several videos of Alan Dershowitz day after day going to the farmer's market and recording the pierogi vendors and coming with a group of people and demanding that they sell him some pierogis. And this is like a tweet that he issued the day after they just like continued to refuse. He said, "Don't buy pierogis tainted with the poison of anti-Semitism. As I correctly suspected, the bigot who refused to sell me pierogi, Krem Miskovich, is a notorious anti-Semite who is part of an anti-Semitic organization that protests Jewish, not only Israeli, cultural events." And so I believe here he's referencing these two women. So there's a couple referencing their involvement in some anti-Zionist activism as well. And really just trying to take a stand, and one saying that they are not Jewish, and two saying that they are anti-Semitic for...
Wait, are they Jewish?
I believe so, but I could be wrong on that. I'm not really sure, actually.
Gotta
so
get your
maybe
pierogi
not.
facts right.
Yeah, I gotta
also live in a city. Pittsburgh has so many good pierogies. This is making me want a pierogi.
Yeah. Yeah, but no one does the whole like, oh, you are not really Jewish, you are actually an anti-Semite, more than Alan Dershowitz over the last 2 years especially. And also specifically going and targeting several Jewish students at a bunch of like specifically elite universities and making sure that they just can't get hired, can't get jobs. But I feel like it's just evident that he believes anything that doesn't serve him personally is an act of anti-Semitism.
I appreciated that you were excited that you had a Polish tie-in.
Yeah.
You were like, I gotta get this out there.
Yeah.
That's so interesting. I had no idea.
Yeah, maybe pop on down to Martha's Vineyard and see what's going on. It would be nice to get some on the ground gumshoe reporting.
Unfortunately, you can't just pop there because you have to take a ferry. Long.
Not a casual pot.
Yeah. I can ask. I have a friend who is there often. Maybe she's there.
I think sorry, you go first.
No, that's just so interesting. I was gonna say. And I think something I find interesting about it too is like pierogis are the Polish food that I found like kind of the least quote unquote Jewish, because Jews, like Ashkenazi Jews, don't really have an equivalent to pierogis, but like, they also have like potato pancakes as part of Polish cuisine, which is like very Ashkenazi Jewish. And other things like smoked fish and these types of things. So I think that's also kind of interesting and kind of makes it more ironic. But yeah, I had no idea, but I think it's classic comparing or equating anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism, which I think that it's important to highlight that like anti-Semitism, there is actual anti-Semitism today. I think that Israel's actions are causing more anti-Semitism, like genuine anti-Semitism. I don't think this is genuine anti-Semitism, to clarify, but I think this is just classic, what he does and these false equation. And I think too, like the defending sexual predators part, like probably is the real reason that they're not selling to him. And so, yeah, I think it's just this classic, like, knee jerk, like, oh, this is because I'm Jewish, but it doesn't really sound like that's it at all.
I just wanted to now that we've had our slight pierogi diversion, just kind of returning to your time in Poland, just is there anything else that you wanted to talk about that we haven't kind of gotten to yet in terms of like your experiences, your reflections, either like personal or academic, like how this has influenced the way that you think about your work, or more personally, anything you wanted to share that we haven't gotten to yet?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, I have like two things. I think in terms of my work, I don't think I want to study Eastern Europe. I certainly don't have the language skills to do it. But something I've thought a lot about is the way that we are seeing this resurgence of the Bund, particularly in Vilnius, and in Krakow and in Prague. We're seeing some too in Warsaw and other places. And so like, I think that that's something I've been thinking a lot about, like how is that kind of mirroring this growth of Jewish anti-Zionism in the US and also this resurgence of the Bund, like you were talking about, at your university and in these other places here. And so, yeah, I think academically that's something where I'm like, wow, this is really interesting what's happening here. And I think then personally, things like that, and even just seeing general Jewish life in Eastern Europe today does really feel like this type of Jewish survival. I think often there's this conversation of like, what is Jewish survival? What does it look like? I think so often people answer that question with, you know, the existence of the state of Israel. But to me, that's obviously not Jewish survival. That breaks all Jewish values, you know. But to me, like so much of what I did in or experienced in Poland, and also I traveled afterwards in Lithuania, Hungary, and the Czech Republic, and in Poland with my dad. I think so much of what I did there really felt like Jewish survival. So I think to me the biggest one was going to these two shtetls that my great grandfathers were from. And then I wrote, I'm sure you saw Yasmin on Instagram, I wrote about them first in Yiddish and then translated it to English. And I think being able to do that really was powerful and really is this type of survival, and really like survival from the pogroms, from the Holocaust, and also from the Zionist project's disdain for Yiddish and for the diaspora. And really this rebuilding of diaspora Jewish life. And so, yeah, I think those things. And then I think, like I said earlier, really learning Yiddish in Poland. And in the last day of my class, we read Mordechai Anilevich's last letter that he wrote in Yiddish. And I think to me, that was like such a powerful experience to read that so close to the place that he died and so close to the street that's named after him. And so, yeah. And then I think going to this protest I went to was also this type of Jewish survival. I think to me, part of living up to the legacy of the Warsaw Ghetto uprising fighters and of the women in the Jewish labor movement and all of these people is fighting against oppression and fighting for justice. And that has to include fighting for a free Palestine from the river to the sea, and fighting against this genocide. And there's this Yiddish saying, which is Mir wollen sie überleben, which is we will outlive them, them being, you know, fascists and, you know, yeah, fascists, and fascists and anti-Semites. And I think to me, outliving them is all of these things that I experienced, and, you know, being able to go to these shtetls, being able to learn Yiddish in Poland, reading this letter there being some Jewish life in Eastern Europe, and, you know, this slow but sure resurgence of Jewish progressive life in Europe. And then I think fighting for a free Palestine really is outliving them.
And yeah, I think your activism in the US also is a really beautiful testament to that.
Yeah, definitely.
Great. I feel like it's a lovely place to end. Do you have anything else, Ahmed?
No, I think that's it. Thank you so much for taking the time to join and have this conversation with us.
Yeah, and to really reflect. Like, it was so cool hearing the interplay of like your personal and academic perspectives. I really valued it.
Thank you so much. Yeah, thank you for having me. This was so great. I was so honored when you invited me, and yeah, this was really great. And it does feel like another way to reflect on my experiences.
Well, promise to have you back if you can take that ferry over to Martha's Vineyard and, you know, like I said, just get some firsthand accounts of what's been going on there. But in all seriousness, yeah, this was great. And I feel like we learned a lot. And hopefully, if anyone has comments, questions, or anything, feel free. I feel like we need to just like plug the email and all that stuff more. So fieldbetweenpod@gmail.com. You can also get in touch on Instagram.
Yeah, if you have any like,
DM
follow-up
us.
questions about Julia's like academic work, we can definitely pass them on to her.
Yeah. Cool. All right. Thanks, everyone. Bye.
Euer narische Zionisten, mit euer narischen Seichel, ihr mögt doch gehen zu dem Arbeiter und lernen bei ihm ein Seichel. Ihr mögt doch gehen zu dem Arbeiter und lernen bei ihm ein Seichel.
Wilt uns führen kann Jerusalem, wir sollen dort goldeien, wir wollen besser sein in Russland, wir wollen sich befreien.
Wir wollen besser sein in Russland, wir wollen sich befreien.